Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to New Books in History, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Mark Clovis, your host for the channel. Today, I'm talking with David Kunzel, author of the book Rebirth of the English Comic Strip, A Kaleidoscope, 1847 to 1870. David, welcome to the New Books Network.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to give a little publicity to this book, which has not yet been reviewed.
Well, we're happy to have you on our show, and hopefully we can attract some reviewers as well as some readers. I was wondering if you could start us off by telling our listeners something about yourself.
Well, I'm many years now retired from being a professor of art history at UCLA, where I've been a long, long time. Came to the United States out of England, actually had a rather nice job at the National Gallery in London as official lecturer, the only one they had, and I was the boss, so to speak, lecturing in situ on the pictures. I'll never forget that experience, which I regret, having lost when I came here, where I was able to take students occasionally to museums, which was a special treat, but not, of course, on a regular basis. We had to stay in the galleries there. But anyway, that I left in 1964, and I've been here in California since. And I've written about 12, 13 books.
I was wondering if you could... Oh, go ahead.
Half of which would be on comic strips, but the other half not.
I was wondering if you could explain how this book fits with your other works. Exactly, what have your other works been about that relate to the book that we'll be discussing here?
Yes, good question. I have been all my life concerned with the intersection of art and history. And when I arrived at this country, the Vietnam War was flaring up, and I realized that it sharpened my sense that popular culture does a lot, engages itself in war, for and against, and that how shall I say, the first book I was working on, which is my dissertation, which became a very big book published by the University of California Press, which really covered a great territory from the invention of printing, essentially, in the middle of the 15th century, down to 1826, as a kind of special date. It's down to Töpfer. And I was prompted to write about the comic strip, I think by a man who turned out to be my supervisor and became a friend, Ernst Gombrich, who in the preface to his Art and Illusion, which came out in 1962, was it, says that somebody should trace the history of the comic strip or picture story. I think he called it picture story, which was perhaps a more polite, more dignified term than comic strip, especially since a lot of the strips which I've always dealt with are not at all comic. Anyway, picture story is a good alternative title, and it held for a long time. And I decided that what Gombrich said should be done, which was to trace the history from Hogarth to Töpfer, was worth doing. And so I did that. And I discovered that there was so much before Töpfer, since the invention of printing, since the first comic strip, which shows up really in with the invention of printing, virtually. The first volume didn't get to Töpfer at all. The further subsequent volumes did, and I've done 3 on Töpfer. And meanwhile, I'm not going to try and list. Meanwhile, I've done some books which were really very much connected with the wars that the U.S. has been consistently engaged in, aggressive imperialist wars, which I found quite horrifying and detestable, starting with the Vietnam War, and then later with many others, and coinciding with a long interest I'd had in Dutch art, which I taught a great deal, and where I found a niche, a gap in otherwise a very prolific Dutch art history industry, an enormous amount of attention paid to the 17th century, to the golden age of the Dutch. But they hadn't dealt with the war as represented by the Dutch. And I wrote a book which absorbed me a lot, and I'm very, very proud of, and brought out by the Dutch themselves in a very fine edition called From Criminal to Courtier, the Soldier in Netherlandish Art. I use the word Netherlandish because that's more than Dutch, right? In Netherlandish Art, 1550 to 1672. There again is a case of, I seem to like to choose precise dates, and there is a reason for them as there are for the current one, which we're now ready to talk about.
It's a fascinating book, and it's one that I thought was really interesting because I knew very little about the subject. And you not only talk about this period of publishing in England as it relates to the visual art, but you also connect it to, you show how it came about after an early period. As you make it clear from the beginning, this isn't the first time that visuals are represented in print, but you do distinguish this period from what you term the Great Age of Caricature. I was wondering if you could perhaps start us off by talking about those antecedents. I mean, what was the Great Age of Caricature, and why was there a hiatus between that period and this period where you have the development of what comes to be termed the comic strip?
Yes, well, indeed, the comic strip never dies. I think it reaches you can say, its first great, capital G, climax, capital C, with Hogarth, who is a pictorial narrator par excellence, who had an immense effect. You could say not just in England, but majorly in England, but also in Europe, where he had imitators, particularly in Germany. And he had disciples who were not as good as he was. But along comes an era in English history which is very spectacular. It becomes very restive. I mean, it is the age essentially of the American Revolution, right? In the second half of the 18th century. And that's when the Great Age starts. Actually, the Great Age of Caricature is generally dated from the 1780s, when Gilray and Rowlandson burst on the scene, the major artists, and continues very active, although diminishingly, up to about 1820, when the appetite for what was the primary vehicle of satire, including a lot of comic strips, satires on political lives very much, it peters out in the 1820s. A sense that a new format is required, and gradually, in the very first sort of avatar of the comic strip in the journal, which is what I'm concerned with later, does start in the 1820s, when the English were the first to try to put pictures into daily or weekly supplements, into newspapers. And newspapers gradually filled with comic cuts, as they were called, and they were comic, usually stolen from existing albums. And the new format after the English Great Age of Caricature, broadsheet, was the album. And the master of the album was, the album, was a sort of a congeries of funny stuff all over the place, all over the society, really. A little bit, I would say quite a bit political, but also a lot of social, and perhaps the social coming to the fore as the politics in England tended to go a little softer after the Napoleonic Wars. And here is the master of caricature. The word has embedded in himself now in common parlance, and usually in a negative sense, as it remains today. To do a caricature of somebody is to make him look ridiculous or in some way unfairly distorted, that sort of thing. Anyway, here is Cruikshank, who was the master of caricature in the Great Age, carrying very prolifically the mantle of Gilray, whose work table he inherited. By the way, it's a nice little detail. Gilray went mad, I think it was in 1810, and here is Cruikshank, a 19-year-old, with a father who was already a caricaturist, really quite well established and respected. But anyway, along comes George, who just goes all over the place, and he is indefatigable, and remains so partly in the broadsheet, which lingered on a bit, certainly into the 20s, but he is at that point beginning to shift into not the journal caricature, which was still sort of exceptional and it had its place a little bit, or, well, I should say, a conspicuous bit, but a limited conspicuous bit, shall we say, in the new journal, the new newspapers, particularly the sporting pictures, which didn't feel they need to stick to news. They could just talk about sporting events, like pugilism and racehorsing and that sort of thing. Anyway, those become quite popular and creating an audience that was more literate than it had been before and broader. And Cruikshank really works into that very fast and produces a number of albums, which are often called comic cuts, and were a sort of scattering of squibs on social foibles and peculiarities without too much direction. And they were sometimes published as a typical title. Scraps and Sketches was a typical title used for Cruikshank's albums in the 30s and 40s. So those were albums which was something different from what happens in my era by 1847, which is the entry into dedicated comic or satirical magazines. And I say use this word for both, comic perhaps for the art and satirical for the literary content, which was often quite serious and was very carefully honed to try and improve conditions in England that were felt to be rather awful by the 1840s. Social conscience of the Britons had wakened a bit. Conditions in factories, which was industrialization, which was a horror for many people. Anyway,
well, I was
have I
thinking
gone far enough with that? Does that question take me far enough to 1847?
It does, but I do want to mention that that I was as I was listening to you, I was thinking about some of the works that are in your book, and I should make clear your book is a very visual book, and it's unfortunate that's something that we can only discuss in the podcast without providing any sort of visual examples, but you provide a generous selection of samples. And I was thinking about how those themes stand out in the selections of Cruikshank's art that you feature. I was thinking about Tom and Jerry, which is a fairly light work, but then you have The Bottle, which is a very serious commentary. As you mentioned, it was a very
yes.
widespread one. But as you mentioned, it was a social commentary. It wasn't really a political commentary. You don't have them calling out the prime minister of the day or the government of the day and saying that.
No, indeed.
It's more about saying it's more about the social condemnation of the effects of alcoholism on families.
The caricature has become, when I say so, it remained a little political, and there were political satirists. But perhaps it's where it really went to bed and woke up from bed, went into dream world as well, was in the social world. Yes. And you mentioned, you mentioned the Cruikshank bottle, and then and Drunkard's Children comes after that, and then the toothache, which is another sort of satire in its way, and another format. But meanwhile, this is the point that has to be made, and you should stop me lest I run on too long on this. The Töpfer, on whom I've written a great deal and thought a great deal and amassed by accident, by bequeathing from a dear old lady in New York a huge collection of original Töpfer picture stories. And I thought of starting out this interview by just recounting an anecdote, a personal anecdote, which is to say that I've been wandering out. I'm now in recovery from an operation, right? And I've been in the habit of sort of wandering slowly around the streets of where we live. And people will politely ask me, oh, hello, what are you doing now? And how are you? What is the object of your research? And at that point, actually, I'd come back to Töpfer after having gone else a little bit into his descendants. So I said, "Oh, I'm studying still, thinking this is, the biggest name I had on my book, so to speak, was, oh, I'm studying Rodolph Töpfer." And they would look at me blankly. Who? Töpfer. And I would say, you haven't heard of him? No. And that really set me thinking that anyone in Switzerland would have heard of him. A lot of most educated people in France, and I'm tempted to say most educated people in Germany, would have heard of him. And in Switzerland, they would have known him very well because he was a Swiss. And he appeared on a postage stamp. What more could you want? I should say not Töpfer himself, not his portrait, but the characters he created. And his genius was to create extraordinarily funny, bizarre, and crazy, crazy characters. And he shows up in the 1830s. So he is really the bridge between the great age of caricature and the age which I'm dealing with in this book, which starts in 1847 via a Cruikshank imitation of Töpfer, which failed, we are told. He didn't sell many copies, and he realized that Töpfer's not easy to imitate, especially when you have a established style and mode of narration that I have. He really wanted to tell short stories or even novels and pictures. And, Dickens got there first, right? He couldn't do it. He tried, and tried even notoriously to take credit for Oliver Twist, which was a very unfortunate episode in his life, Cruikshank's life, because he made himself ridiculous. But anyway, he wanted to be a novelist, we could say, at a certain point. And this failed Mr. Lambkin, he was called, the life and adventures. It's a courtship, very conventional and rather poorly drawn. It's Cruikshank trying to make a buck or trying to get in on the game again, but with a narrative album in the manner of Töpfer, except it wasn't anything like Töpfer's style that nobody could imitate, well, least of all Cruikshank could imitate. He was imitated a lot. Well, that's a long story. Let me put it this way. Töpfer was widely imitated for his line and his thinking, his improvisation, his saying, look, hey, you don't have to be an artist to produce funny stories. You just draw a silly face and see what that face says to you. And he says this in one of his many theoretical treatises. He was Töpfer was a tremendous theorist of his art. And of art, all kinds of art, actually, because he was an art critic in a big way in Geneva. But he says in one of his books on how to do caricature, essentially, just draw a face and find out what that face might do. Is this the man who would get hell from his wife all the time? Is this a man who would be a henpecked husband? Or is this a man who, or is this a man who would turn to all kinds of crazy professions which he was ill-suited for, or become a sort of a ne'er-do-well, or, you could see an adventure, you can imagine an adventure coming out of a funny face. like this.
And,
Okay.
and yet, as you describe in the
I
book,
got off your question, went elsewhere.
it's totally fine though, because it definitely helps to inform parts of your book. I was thinking though about when you start talking, because while you do discuss that, that sort of artwork in the various chapters of your book, you do though also talk about how these artists of the period are definitely engaging with current affairs, although not in the way that, say, a modern day political cartoonist will. One of the things that struck me as I was reading it was the recurrent theme of Francophobia, and about how you see in Punch, in the Flight of Louis Philippe, that there's this recurrent. It's as if when they're commenting on politics, they're playing it safe, but they're at the same time doing some oftentimes wicked visual commentary satire on some of the key events of the day, but in a way that won't necessarily bring upon them the ire of whoever happens to be in power at the moment.
Well, it did. It did at certain moments which can be traced, and you have to sort of wiggle them out. And I discovered only, looking very carefully at the drawings of the Flight of Louis Philippe, for instance, and what kind of reputation he had in Britain, where he was exiled to. I'm sorry, not Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe was exiled to England. It was a great place to be exiled to. It was safe. And more worrying to the English was the advent of Louis Napoleon, who seized the throne and became emperor of the French. And although he didn't actually make war on the British, he made war on the Prussians, which was a great error on his part. Not that making war on the British would have got him anywhere at all, except it was a different kind of disaster. It was a certain kind of, because there was a rivalry, mainly a colonial rivalry going on. French grabbed Algeria and Britain grabbed big chunks of Africa and the West Indies and that sort of thing. So that rivalry was going on, and that shows up in the comic strips. And in fact, the Flight of Louis Philippe, which you mentioned, by Richard Doyle, is at one point breaks its stride of the adventures, fantastic adventures which are in themselves, I think, derive in some measure in their fantasy and their absurdity and in their sort of travel obsession. This is obsession with travel at this time. That Louis Philippe was a good target, and that he should, as he is exiled from France in the June days of 1848 and comes to England, he's a good topic for satire. And he shows up in the very first comic strip I deal with, discounting Cruikshank, who is more picture story than comic strip. He shows that he's suddenly interpolated, not as a portrait of him, but as a portrait he is satirized as. That is to say, a pear, une poire. He was known as the poire because he had a pear-shaped head. And he was much ridiculed for this by Daumier and company. But he was finally thrown out and found himself then in the middle of a revolution, which is what this comic strip is indirectly dealing with at that point. And the revolution, which is the story of the adventures of a Mr. Crindle, who's trying to escape who's escaping a poverty or a wife or something like that. They're always escaping something. Anyway, and he gets to the east coast. I think it must be the east coast of Africa. It's called Kwashi Bungo. And there he finds himself elected king and marrying the queen, the native queen. And this is obviously a play on what is happening in France, as if by some fantasy, the English were watching eagerly at the shenanigans in France and probably saying to themselves, "Oh, thank God we've got a good parliamentary system. We don't have to change monarchs, and we're not on the risk of getting another monarch," which is exactly what happened in France. And so this Crindle, after occupying this New English colony, as it were, never stated as such, but and with mixing with the natives, and in fact nearly getting killed by them, nearly getting eaten by them, and finally deciding it's time to make his escape and coming back home, and then what happens? I think he gets married. In many of these stories, after most horrendous and extraordinary and absurd adventures, they settle down to a very conventional bourgeois life at the wedding, in a marriage.
That was another.
So does that get us to where you want to go?
Well, it does, but it also actually brings up another point that I was thinking about as I was reading your book, which is there's something that you see in it that's really fascinating, which another kind of theme of the era is the emergence of the bourgeois. And I was thinking of it in terms of such cartoons as the Browns Visit the Great Exposition. You could argue perhaps a little bit of Tom and Jerry. It's this idea that which I thought was interesting because it speaks to how the audience of who these cartoons are, that they're speaking to a particular group of people who might find these things amusing. The notion that of going and visiting these places, the notion of going on tours, and how it spoke to how the times are changing. And my command of Hogarth isn't that great, but I was thinking that it's rather different in terms of that topic or subject than what you saw, say, during the 1750s, the 1760s, and so forth.
You said earlier, you mentioned the middle class.
Yes.
The great growth in the middle class in Britain, a very precocious growth, you could say, of the middle class. And it's just the middle class which is, I'm tempted to say the upper middle class, make that distinction, which was the patron of Hogarth. Mm-hmm. I mean, his engravings were not cheap, but they certainly appealed to what can be called not aristocratic mentality, which otherwise seemed to govern art patronage. And at a very expensive level, buying like crazy from Italy, particularly. But there was a middle class already growing then for Hogarth, and Hogarth was then adapted to the middle class in a very curious way. It's because Hogarth is at certain points very, very sexual. And this is what turned me on as a child. I know when I discovered Hogarth at the age of 7, without quite knowing what sex was, I knew that this was raunchy stuff. And there was evil and drink and sex and violence, to satisfy me at that age. Rather conscious of knowing that my family background, which was very sedate, never dealt with these topics at all. That was a sort of taboo. But I discovered a volume of Hogarth, which in the library left to me, including a complete set of Punch, 1841 to 1891, left to me by my uncle, to whom I dedicate my book. I don't know if you've noticed, there is a rather good-looking young man who was not more than 20 when he died, and I dedicate the book to him because he set me going on Hogarth and then on Punch. And there is so much Punch in, and you mentioned the Punch attitude to the world affairs at the time and their lack of I was going to say fear of France. Yeah, it was a real fear of France, as well as a sense of superiority to France, having beaten Bonaparte at Waterloo, right? Don't forget that. The French had been sort of sidelined a bit in foreign affairs. And the English were rather nervous that another Napoleon would come along, as he did, Napoleon III, 30 years, Waterloo is 1815, and here's Louis Napoleon III, Emperor of France, by 1851, 1852. So that's a span of time in which the English were sort of feeling, you could say, since you mentioned the Great Exhibition, feeling their superiority and their peace and their privilege of peace. And there are several pictures in my book showing how peaceful John Bull, the embodiment of Britain, saw itself, and how lucky they were not to be caught up in the violence which was destroying much of Europe. I don't say destroying in a radical sense, but it's certainly causing immense disturbances and overthrowing thrones, overthrowing societies all over Europe in 1848, 1849. And that is what this particular comic strip is referring to. And I think Mr. Quindle getting himself among the natives of Africa. This is perhaps the English projection. You know, they're not too worried about making their impact on Europe anymore. They're there to stay, and they are the boss in some ways. The sort of diplomatic weight that they carry, greater than, small island, greater than the bigger France, shall we say, at this point. And they...
The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes. I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com.
I've wandered off your point.
That's so funny. To bring us back to
happens.
What I was thinking was
But
how...
anyway, the point, I'm sorry, yeah. What I want to come back to is, you mentioned the term Franco, did you say Francophilia or Francophobia?
Francophobia.
Because it's both. Towards the French.
Well, I was thinking when we were talking about politics. I was thinking about the Francophobia, which stands out. But there is sometimes a certain affection, but which you also see. I think when we talk about the foreign tours, which are another subject that recurs in some of the cartoons that you focus on.
Yes. Well, the interesting thing about the Francophilia was very real because. I said that perhaps a little rashly, I'm not sure that England, well, no, they felt themselves superior economically, put it that way. Superior as people, who knew how to run a country, knew how to establish a parliament which represented popular interests, which they did partially, not all of them, of course. There's a great deal of agitation going on to improve the conditions in which Parliament was established. But anyway, here they are with a sense of certainly economic superiority, which you could say is justified. But they felt, par contre, I dropped into French, par contre, was not true on the cultural level. France was still the shibboleth, is that the word I'm looking for now? It was the standard of artistic production. French art was greater than any in the world. Well, not looking at Asia, but certainly in Europe. The French theatre, which is very close to the comic strip, in a way that if I had more room to write in this book, which got too big anyway, I would have dealt more with the overlap between comic strip and theatre, which is very marked with. Here I am at a tangent again. Bring me back, please. Find out where I am. Anyway, the comic strip artists, if Cruikshank is one, he's more of a graphic novelist, I think. We're very close to the theatre, and Cruikshank's The Bottle was produced on 8 stages simultaneously in England, you know. Meanwhile, I mean, that is a truly native English production. Otherwise, the English theatre was very much dependent on French. You know, they copied the French. I think there's a moment in Crumble, which I shouldn't test myself on this. Anyway, there's an early Dickens novel where the hero, is it Nicholas Nickleby, goes off, finds himself employed by a theatrical company. And he's very quick to learn, and he's very funny, and he's a stage presence already, although he hasn't made his name in the world. And he's told by Mr. Crumbles, this is the name of the director of this theatre, okay, we want a new play for next week. Next week? What do you mean? Well, all right, I mean, give me the script, and I'll try and learn parts of it that I need, that I will impersonate by heart over the weekend or something. He said, oh, there's no English script. We've only got the French version. And you know French, don't you? He said, well, yes. Okay, so just work the French into English, and we've got our play. And this is what the English were doing, not quite as crudely as that, because they took good French plays and put it into, I suppose, good English. It's a kind of theatre nobody looks at today, so there's no way to really judge it, although there is scholarly literature galore, I'm sure, as there is on everything else in the 19th century. But the English theatre land was immensely popular, and the popularity of the theatre at various levels, from music hall up to opera, marked the comic strips up to a point. I don't see a very immediate overlap, but it is there insofar as you look at the life of Watts Phillips. Watts Phillips does a number of really good comic strips, and he wrote plays. And I've mentioned that Cruikshank was turned into the theatre a great deal for his most successful efforts, after which he stopped. That is to say, the drunkard, the bottle. And this is coming back, which is, I think, one can always do profitably. The idea of a middle class. There is a new class growing up which will take on the comic strip in a way that, shall we say, the elite, the cultural elite, couldn't do. There's no evidence of anyone saying, oh, yes, Dickens is great, yeah, but you should look at all those comic strips that, Dickie Doyle is doing in Punch, about Louis Philippe. Aren't they great? No, nobody looked at that as serious comment, although we do. And I try to, as I describe the liberties that the artist takes with the facts and the degree to which he respects the facts, which in the case of Louis Napoleon, the Emperor Napoleon, are extraordinary. He was an adventurer in the first degree, and he staged 2 attempted coups attempted revolutions against the existing French government. He was exiled twice to England. He was all over Europe. He was a European figure even before he became the president of France and then the emperor of France. And this is an interesting point to make. The story of Louis Philippe, or Louis le Petit, as he's called, Louis the Little, as a sort of reference to the way he was known to the French as Louis le Grand, Louis the Great. What did I say, Louis? I mean, he wasn't a Louis. I'm sorry, Napoleon the Great. So Napoleon le Petit shows up in 2 ways in England in Punch, with sort of straight-out cartoons which show a fear of his rearmament, which he was doing. He was trying to rearm, make France a military power again. And his nothing ostensibly hostile to Britain, except that Britain didn't like any country making colonies where they weren't, right? Mm-hmm. And here he was taking over Algeria in double quick time, and the English didn't like that, and they represented that takeover of Algeria indirectly as the invasion of Normandy by William the Conqueror, showing up as a parodic comic strip, which I spent a whole chapter on, and it was a fascinating topic, the Bayeux Tapestry, which is actually an embroidery, not a tapestry. But anyway, the Bayeux Tapestry is one of the great works of art, right, that everyone... well, you don't have to go to Bayeux to see it, because there's a perfect replica in Reading in England. And it is reproduced in, I do not exaggerate, 100 books. And analyzed for its take on this momentous event in English history, the only time the English have ever been, the British, well, it's really the English, have been invaded and taken over, was in 1066. And this invasion is represented in the Bayeux Tapestry in a way that the scholars have been chewing over, for decades. I think you could say since the first books began to appear, I think at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, perhaps even since the facsimile was first made in Britain. It's interesting that the British made a facsimile of this great work of art, which is not easy to copy, in 1820s. And it is on that basis, I think, that Dickie Doyle, the first of the great artists, maybe you will ask me about the other great artists, I think he is a great artist, represents in his Bayeux Tapestry. And I put in the chapter heading the title used by Punch itself, because Bayeux refers not only to the Bayeux Tapestry, or the letters of Bayeux being in that word, but inserted in the middle is Sir Charles Barry, who was rebuilding the Houses of Parliament, a big event, obviously, after the fire of the 1830s, and it had to be rebuilt. And that was a chance for the English to show their paces as painters. And the curious thing, when I was saying earlier, inferiority that the English felt, or perhaps put it more politely, were trying to overcome vis-a-vis the French. And they produced Constable and Turner, didn't they? Good as any Frenchman? No? Anyway, the Houses of Parliament were to be the venue for a new English school of history painting. And the requirement of any artist to put in a cartoon, ask me more about that word later if you want, to put in a drawing, a full-size drawing of his design for the Westminster Hall murals. They had to take a topic from English history, that's kind of logic there. And here is Dickie Doyle doing his bit to suggest a comic version of the Norman invasion, as it were, to go on the wall. He says, "So this is my offering." It's entirely different at a level of stylistic level, which actually, and this is an interesting thing, owe more to Töpfer than they do either to the 12th, the 11th century artists, women artists, incidentally, who made the Bayeux Tapestry. It was more to Töpfer than to this bizarre, this by the totally outmoded, but just in its way, very English, cherished style of a crude style. And it's a very crudity that Doyle parlays into something more Töpferish. And that is the subject of a whole chapter, which I had trouble cutting back. I remember I'd go through it again and again and again, saying, this is too long, cut it back. Oh dear, that's my life.
I actually want to pick up on a couple of themes that you've discussed, because given how much is in the book and how much time we have remaining, I want to be a bit more condensory. You mentioned earlier about how Hogarth was aiming towards a particular audience, and how his engravings were very expensive. You're talking, though, in this book about a period where you're starting to see the expansion of a literary market, and the journals you mentioned, Punch being the most obvious one, but you also have Man in the Moon, Illustrated London News, and these are the ones that they're geared more towards a much broader spectrum of English society. And I was thinking about how, while you don't talk about that in the book, you do illustrate it with the illustrations, because we've been talking a lot about the politics, the Francophobia, the Francophilia, but a lot of the arts that you have in here, it's commenting on social foibles, commenting upon people. Sometimes it's satirizing the middle class, sometimes it's satirizing the upper class in ways that the middle class would find particularly funny. It strikes me about how you don't have in a lot of these analyzed drawings depictions of lords and monarchs. You have instead.
That's fascinating. I think I should have developed that more. Yes, the heroes are middle class heroes.
Yes,
or would be middle class, shall we say? That's a comfortable or an upper middle class, a moneyed middle class.
Once you can travel, for example.
Middle class. That is how Mr. Crindle starts in The Man in the Moon, and many of the strips several of them start with a sudden inheritance, from an aunt or an uncle in Australia or something, who makes a poor nephew, a poor relative, his heir. And what does he do with that? Guess, he squanders it on frivolities. So this is a comment on what happens when lower middle class, should we say, starts out in lower middle class, suddenly becomes so upper middle class with aristocratic ambitions, and have mistresses, and horses and that sort of thing. And that is frowned on. That has to be punished.
There's a lot of
always punished.
There's a lot of mocking there. I think
even with horses, they're not supposed to be owning horses. The middle classes, should we say, don't even own a horse. Which, well, you do in the countryside, but you don't if you're a clerk in the city. And he goes to the horse show with his friends, Miss Smith. Gars and Robinson, and they go to the horse show on horseback and immediately get thrown and sort of almost crushed underfoot by galloping cavalcade of cavalry, which shows up as part of the display, that sort of thing. So they get humiliated. And the humiliation of ambition of this kind is very typical. And it's a thread which I get unhappy now talking to you, Mark. There's a thread I should have drawn out. There should have been a chapter, called just that, the punishment of ambition. And that I think you were headed towards that idea, and I don't deal with that sufficiently. I don't bring it together sufficiently.
Well, it does come across, I thought, well, with the selection. You don't have to draw it out because it's there. You have, and you have with the notion of, and I was thinking of Keene when he's like The Perilous Journey by Water, where he has Mrs. Trott and how she is doing this thing that a century ago would have been only the purview of the upper classes, journeying on a tour of the continent, and you have all the middle class. She is as trying to remain this proper member of the middle class and all the adventures that she goes on. Or you have Mr. Wilderspin by McConnell.
Wilderspin, yes. Hello.
Yes.
I haven't lost you, have I?
No, you haven't.
No. Anyway, Gap. The Gap. I just finished. Yes. Look, the punishment of middle class ambition is not. it assumes that certain kinds of ambition are okay, like a bit of touring on the continent. You mentioned it wasn't just the aristocracy who perhaps were the primary visitors abroad in the 18th century, but the English were going abroad. Cook's tours were organized by the 40s and 50s, and I mean on a cut price basis. And they were getting to France, easy to get to the cross-channel steamer, and relatively cheap. It was made, you got group fares, the kind of thing we're familiar with today, and you get guided tours even. Either you could hire your own guide relatively cheaply, a local guide perhaps who could speak your language, since the English could speak no other language but English, but you certainly had as shall we say, an upper middle class person, or a perhaps middle class person who is willing to, throw a bit of money at a long summer holiday by walking abroad and deciding that it was a very healthy exercise to begin with, as well as culturally informative, because they might get as far as Italy, which is what they do, and which Töpfer does, by the way. But of course, Töpfer starts out much nearer to Italy because he's out of Geneva. Anyway, there is that aspect of travel which runs through many of the stories, which are. I'd like to just put it this way: it travels geographically and travels of the imagination, which is what happens with the very first comic strips in Man of the Moon, which I make a great fuss over, the Man in the Moon, because it's, and I say at the end, well, what a shame, I'm weeping at the fate of Man in the Moon, which is to close down after 2 years, So why isn't the public buying this magazine? Well, we're told, actually, that the way that the comic strip was inserted into the magazine made for awkward reading. It had to be folded twice in, and was presumably a sort of expensive gluing job or something. That was part of it. But it is a phenomenon that continues right through the century, that the cheap magazines that run half of my comic strips die within 2 years. That is to say, the comic strip doesn't die. Well, in some cases, the comic strip obviously is intended to continue, but is killed by the death of the magazine. And you have to ask the question, why is it that a twopenny magazine costing less than a threepenny Punch is dying all the time, whereas a threepenny Punch is not? The answer to that is, one of the answers to that is that the threepenny Punch was appealing to people for whom threepence was nothing. And so it had an upper-class audience. We know this, that the politicians bought Punch. And a politician, she even said a politician who wasn't made fun of in Punch hadn't arrived. And this Punch, of course, was not just, I would say habitually, it was actually sporadically, is perhaps the word, a comic strip purveyor, which came in, I'm tempted to say, by stealth. And the whole story of how the comic strips got into Punch, when Punch really wasn't that interested in comic strips, came back to haunt me a little when I said in an earlier volume, which went sort of flightily over this whole era, because I did another book which covered the whole of European comic strip, 6 different countries. Must have been crazy then. Running from, essentially from Töpfer, actually, I could say from Goya, but from Töpfer through to the end of 1896, which is when the so-called American comic strip is born, or the American comic strip is so-called born, with the Yellow Kid. Now, so the question I'm asking is, and the question that Punch asked itself, why are we successful? And these other newspapers were not. These other twopenny things were not. Well, the answer is, perhaps, the taste of the English who were not looking for comic strips in particular. They were looking for, jokes and cartoons about their government, essentially, and about certain social crazes, like beards and whatnot. That they took to the cheaper magazines, not just because they were cheaper, but because they were they were more impudent than Punch. I mean, and the reason the upper classes didn't want to buy Punch sometimes was to begin with, certainly, it was criticism of the royal family, which you didn't do at first until the royal family established themselves. But they had a hard time to begin with. And Punch, at the very beginning, was a radical magazine, which obviously did not appeal to the upper classes who were happy the way things were, more or less. No, there were abuses, of course, but more or less, where England was top dog and that sort of thing. And for a few years ran radical cartoons, hostile to the gamekeeper, for instance, or hostile to the aristocrat who was punishing anyone who dared to hunt his deer or his hare on his land. So there's there's a class difference between Punch and all the other magazines is very, very marked. But that still doesn't explain to me why the cheaper magazine, which was fun in its own way, failed. Could it be that they'd had the five great artists that I make much of, and I put at the beginning, saying these are the stars of this book, which are Cruikshank, who's actually not in Punch at all, but he sort of belongs in there. But there is, Leach, Tenniel, Keane, Du Maurier, and Doyle. Anyway, those are the major artists, all of whom were known in the outside world, in the world outside of Punch. Although they were much cherished for their cartoons in Punch, and not apparently noticed even for their comic strips, which were relatively few. There's no Mr. Wilderspin, for instance, which goes on for 23 pages and is the only real candidate for the title graphic novel in that whole period. I think the other candidate would be Richard Doyle, who, after he quarreled with Punch, which was very unfortunate for Punch because he's a very, very funny and brilliant artist. The Bayeux Tapestry was only part of it. That he left Punch when Punch began attacking the imposition of a Catholic hierarchy in Britain. The Catholics were discriminated against. And they made rude cartoons about the papacy, about the cardinals that had been foisted on Britain, that had never had any cardinals to deal with. And he quit in a huff, which was a great shame for Punch because he was a wonderful artist. And very much regretted by one of the Punch contributors, which was Thackeray, thought it was a great mistake. Now, the whole anti-Catholic crusade was a mistake, and that was Thackeray. But anyway, and Thackeray was their star writer, who incidentally, I think it's probably, now you make me think, he never offered his drawings to Punch. He thought Punch's artists were just a little bit better than he was, who was not a mean caricaturist, and he illustrated 5 of his own novels, did Thackeray. So there's this, come back to the original question. I think the broader classes who appreciated good art for its own sake, of Keane and Tenniel and company, just didn't see this these sort of interlopers who, like Watts Phillips and several other named figures, who at the end of the period actually descend into monosyllabic, into initials, like they don't think they're worse. This is sort of, I find this very curious. There's an artist called Fid at the end of my period, which I actually cheat on, because he goes into his best work is done in 1871, and I'm supposed to end December the 30th and December 1870, right? And here they are early in 1871 doing very funny stuff in a new style, which will be the style of the future. In some ways more Topferian, because more fantastic and less dependent on anatomical knowledge, which all the, the great artists, the quintet of really good artists for Punch were all academically trained and drew beautifully, and were admired for they were collected, for some of them. I'm sure there's certainly people collecting the cartoons, which might not have been their best work, and putting them in a scrapbook or something like that. But anyway, the really good artists stuck with Punch and never went anywhere else. Except, well, there's one exception, but it's too long to recount that. And the fact is that at the end of the period where the Penny and Tuppenny Weekly was launched, began to carry more and more comic strips of, I think, rather inferior quality and progressively inferior. And you could see the recognition by Harmsworth Press, Lord Northcliffe started the first penny newspaper. It may even have been a halfpenny newspaper, it had nothing in it but sort of silly gossip, but it began to put in drawings. And these were attractive to a semi-literate group who had just benefited from the Education Acts of 1870 and onwards, and were able to read the captions, which many of the drawings for a comic strip, you generally have to be able to read the caption. And this is a new clientele, which may not have gone to Punch at all. But they found their home in halfpenny, a bit later halfpenny, but in penny magazines, which were within their grasp financially, and within also their intellectual grasp, I could say, because they tended to be farcical and silly and in some ways nonsensical and what's the word? The word for when something has no significance.
Irrelevant.
When you couldn't see the significance, the moral point, it didn't have to have a moral point. And the master of this is a mistress, so to speak. That is to say, is a woman, Marie Duval, who shows up at the end of my book. It's like a painful caesura for me, because we're beginning to think, we who study these things in England, that Marie Duval was a great artist. She was the first the first caricaturist in Europe, female. And the first female to make a living out of caricature. And in the creation of the first enduring character in caricature, who was a ne'er-do-well, the sort of swindler called Ali Sloper, who shows up at the very end as a reporter for the Franco-Prussian War. And I don't know whether we have enough time left to look into the Franco-Prussian War. You have other questions first, or whether I should think of something very important that I wanted to say and I forgot.
I feel like we covered the book quite well, and I hope that a lot of people can appreciate the breadth and depth of knowledge that went into it, and the artistry that's represented, in the cartoons that you selected. I was going to ask, are you working on? Are you working on anything new?
No.
Ah.
No, I have. I've laid aside my mantle. Oh, standing ground, aren't I? I have a large. I have archives up the kazoo. And the Topfer archive is the most important in many ways because it is constituted by a large number of first editions that appear in four figures on the internet on Abe Books. You know, has $20,000 you can get a first Topfer comic strip book. 20,000. It's crazy. And how can this man still be unknown if he's still so valuable? So I'm not going back into Topfer. I've just been sent two books which I'm tempted to review, but I don't want to. First of all, I have difficulty typing these things on my new computer, but it is a book on Ross, who was the husband of Duval, and I think she outshone him and does the bulk of the really good Alice Sloper stories. And then her husband, Ross, has his own book. You know. But these all belong into the last third of the century. And that's when I won't say I'm not interested anymore, but I recognize, as I say in a rather unhappy, lugubrious sort of epitaph, that after 1870, after the climax, if you like, of the Franco-Prussian War, which in its way is obviously a political climax, but anyway, that the comic strip comes into life in the cheap papers, the halfpenny and the penny papers, but at this lower and I can say childish level. It is a child can afford a halfpenny from its pocket money, you know, or a penny. And the children and adolescents, well, children in a broader sense, were the customers. And the content of is shown in the character of the later magazines, which are not of a... Well, yes, I can say they're not of the caliber. They're very different. They're not serious, for one thing. They're not political anymore, as so many, as you've noted, or you've read enough of the book to see just how I fasten on political issues and chew on them. This doesn't happen anymore. It's trivia. And the word I was looking for was the inconsequential, which Mary Duval herself, whom we now consider, I mean, she has two monographs. She is an important figure. And her kind of inconsequentiality is regarded as modernist. I think in some ways it's a failure of her own imagination, or her sense that after Topfer has somehow done all that can be said in the realm of fantasy.